Just under 2 years after filling and pre-lubing this engine, there's only one single drop of oil on the balancer, probably from the front main. I don't see any on the drain plug or anywhere else. Well, the transmission is more than making up for it. Initially I thought it was the dipstick tube seal again, but no, it was actually the cooler lines that were leaking. They probably didn't appreciate all the manhandling that happened as engines came and went. Luckily, we were able to get a crow's foot wrench up in there and farther tighten the lines to stop the dripping. To prevent this from being a problem again, I decided to make some nice secure mounts for the lines, and used a 5/16 inch bolt hole at the bottom of the engine here. And then right behind the cross member, we've got the same thing with a longer spacer and a piece of rubber hose over them, both to secure them to each other, and also because all the terminals for the starter are right here next to it. Pretty soon we'll have to get that and a bunch of other things wired up, including an array of electric gauges. Among them will be transmission temperature and pressure, which we'll read from senders installed in the transmission. And in order to add those, first we'll need to empty it. Fortunately, we've got a drain plug to use, and once the majority of the fluid is out of there, we can remove the 13 pan bolts and dump out the rest as we remove it. Before we clean things up, let's take a look inside the pan. Yeah, I mean, it's not looking great in here. Last time this pan was off, we saw there was a lot of friction material in there, and this time is unfortunately not really any different. Hopefully a lot of this was just getting flushed out of there, is what I'm gonna pretend. The trans has always worked well. I've never felt it slip. There was like one time a couple of years ago where it kind of like locked the tires up on a 2-3 shift. It's never done it since. I assume there's just a little piece of something that hung a valve up. And other than that, this transmission has always been perfect. So we're just gonna roll with it. Although that beat up and painted oil pan will no longer be part of the picture. We could drill a hole and weld in an NPT threaded bung for the temperature sender, but instead, we're just gonna go with a completely new pan. This one is cast aluminum and features cooling fins as well as an out-of-the-box drain plug. Also, there's no need to worry because it is, in fact, dishwasher safe. The intention here was that we could just drill and tap the pan itself instead of welding anything in, but the material is definitely thinner than I expected. In fact, if it didn't have those fins on the bottom adding some kind of strength, I probably wouldn't trust it. At least the sealing surface is relatively flat, other than a few pretty nasty ejection pin burrs we'll go ahead and file off. The pan's internal depth is the same as the old one, and when mounted it'll sit well above the headers, so it's at least relatively protected. It seems like we should have plenty of space on the passenger side to add our gauge sender, so while we're at it, why not double down? This is the fan switch off of a 3rd gen Camaro, rated to close at about 230 degrees, and in its original application served to turn on the radiator fan, but here we're just going to use it for an overheat warning light on the dash. This right one is just from a Bosch gauge. This is a temperature sender that will give us actual numbers. We'll be mounting the pair of those into the side of the pan, which means we better start drilling. At this point, I realized the sides of the pan were even thinner than I thought, but we've come this far, so let's see what happens. We'll be tapping 1/8 inch NPT threads for the sender, and 3/8 of an inch NPT for the switch. With the 1/8 inch, we have about 3 threads there, but with the coarser 3/8, we've got kind of like 1.5. This was one of those times that I tried to do research, and every single source told me that there's no way that's gonna seal, which just made me want to try it even more, so we're just gonna have to see how that goes. The last thing we'll do to get the pan ready is install the drain plug, and with that, the pan is ready to go onto the car, but we do have a new filter, so we'll replace that first. The filter on there is a mesh screen type. We're replacing that with a much finer Dacron filter, which hopefully we're not going to just clog up right away. With the new filter and gasket installed, it's time to get the oil pan on there, and because of the wall dimensions, we need to use socket cap screws, but I don't like the ones it came with. Despite having standard threads, they take a metric hex bit. The washers they come with are a total joke, and most importantly, they're only 3/4 of an inch long, which just isn't going to cut it. They will be good enough to hang the pan off of the transmission until a set of 1-inch bolts arrives, but we won't be getting them very tight. This was all going well until we got to putting back on the shift cable bracket. I felt like I was forgetting something. The thicker wall of the aluminum pan doesn't leave enough space around the bolt holes, so we'll have to pull out the cable retaining clip and take the bracket over to the vise where we will slim it down. Once that actually fits, we'll give it a coat of paint and while it dries, get completely sidetracked by something else. This time, it's going to be removing the transmission's tail shaft housing. While we're in there, we can address the mildly leaking rear seal, but most importantly, we can try to correct the speedometer. These cars were never meant to have 30-inch tall tires, and definitely not on 2.42 gears. As discussed extensively in a previous episode, the easiest way to adjust this is by changing the driven gear. But the gear that's in there has the least teeth of anything that will fit in this housing. The other option is changing the number of teeth on the drive gear. It sits on the output shaft, and the one in there currently has 18 teeth. At least I'm 90% sure it does. It's definitely yellow, and some of the information I saw said 19, some said 18, but I'm pretty sure I counted it last time and it was 18. So assuming that's correct, we can change to a 19-tooth gear and get this speed a little bit closer. And as fate would have it, I found something that might get us the rest of the way there. This is a speedometer multiplier. I really have no idea what it came off of, but it is a 1.0714 ratio. What that means is that for every turn of the input side, the output will turn 1.07 times. Which, in conjunction with a 19-tooth drive gear, would get us remarkably close to correct. The first thing we need to do is get the drive shaft out of the way, which means removing the 4 bolts holding the U-joint straps to the differential yoke. Except, because of my suspension shenanigans, there's not much forward travel at full droop. We'll have to lift the axle up, and even then remove it kind of diagonally by popping off a U-joint cap. Then we can finally slide the drive shaft out of the transmission and set it aside. Next, we'll unscrew the speedometer cable, remove it as well as the gear housing hold down, and give the gear housing a good wiggle to free it. Then we'll undo the 4 tail shaft housing bolts, confident nothing could go wrong here, give that a bit of a pry to knock it loose, and then fully remove it. There's our yellow speedometer drive gear, which we can remove from the output shaft with just a little tug. There it goes. Hey, yeah, that's a 19-tooth. Explains some of my previous math. Yeah, despite the mind-numbing calculations in that speedometer gear video, I was working with bad data. I really did try to count the teeth on that gear too, I just did it wrong. This does explain my anecdotal observation that the speedometer seemed pretty accurate, and since it turns out this yellow gear is the one we need, it's going right back inside the transmission. That other 19-tooth gear is going to remain new old stock, but at least we can confirm that this gear does exist in at least 2 colors. Alright, what about the tail shaft housing? Hopefully we can at least accomplish something there. Based on the condition it's in, I would guess that bushing was replaced along with the seal right before I bought the car, something like that. So we'll leave the bushing, but the seals are so much easier to replace, I should probably just do it. Please allow me to illustrate exactly how effortless it is by completely destroying it with a seal puller. Boy howdy, that seal's in there. Eventually, we managed to distort the outer diameter enough to pull it out, and despite the dramatic show, nothing but the seal itself was damaged, so we can go ahead and install a new one. For the other side of the tail shaft housing, we've got a new oiled square cut seal, and with that in place, the housing is ready to return to its home on the transmission. Once the 4 bolts have been torqued to 25 foot-pounds, we can reinstall the driven gear housing and use the hold down to lock it in place. Now we'll bring in our fancy new multiplier, and once we've got that snug, we can stack on the speedometer cable. That was certainly easy enough to install, but I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see whether or not it works. Down the line, I'd really like to open this thing up and re-grease it, because who knows how old it is and whether or not I'll be able to find another one if this thing's gears eat each other. Speaking of dried up grease, we're gonna go ahead and top off the U-joint caps and try to clean up the front of the drive shaft as well. This line is probably the original springs in the car. This line is the replacements, so that could be an explanation as to why that seal is leaking. It had to rub through this layer of rust and grime and whatever else. A red Scotch-Brite rub-down should give our new seal the best chance of staying, well, sealed. And once we scrape the grime out of the axle yoke, we'll get the front of the drive shaft oiled and installed. With that all the way in the transmission and the axle once again supported, we'll finagle the rear U-joint back into place. Finally, we'll reinstall the straps and bolts, torquing them to 15 foot-pounds. As the axle is dropped back down, we can watch our slip yoke clearance disappear. There's only about 3/16 of an inch before it bottoms out, and I sure wouldn't tell anybody else to run their car like this, but since we do still have room and it's at full droop, I can live with a narrow margin. That sidetrack got so convoluted it is completely reasonable if you forgot it was one. It's about time we get back to working on our gauge senders. I also want a pressure sender. Now the place to put that is up here. It's pretty hard to see and it's definitely grimy, but this is a plug. This is a pipe plug in here, which required a decent application of force, but we were able to remove it. This 1/8 inch NPT port will give us direct access to mainline pressure, which means the gauge will read in all gears once we install this 90-degree angled fitting and tighten in the sender. Access to this is fairly awkward, but we are able to make it work. You can see how you connect a wire to this thing. It's just got 2 screw-on terminals. And once we run wires down here, it should be simple to get everything hooked up. But as far as the connectors to the sender and switch in the pan, I do have some concerns about their proximity to the header collector. When we hook up the connector, yeah, it's getting pretty toasty looking right about here. This coolant temperature switch is designed to be in a cylinder head almost right up against the exhaust manifold in the body of the car, so this should be pretty resistant to heat, you'd think. But we are asking an awful lot of it, so to give it a helping hand, we're going to be adding a heat shield. Angle iron coming out here, a piece of 16 gauge steel across here. Will it be enough? I don't know. We're sure gonna find out once we build this thing, and we'll start with cutting 2 pieces of 1/8 inch thick 3/4 inch angle iron. We'll drill those to match up with 2 of the 5/16 of an inch transmission pan bolts, and using a folded up piece of cardboard for a guide as to what will fit, plan out and cut a piece of this 16 gauge steel to wrap around the exhaust and act as a heat barrier. Using a pair of hammers and a 2x4, we'll form that over on the workbench and weld it to the chunks of steel angle. With that feeling nice and solid, we'll make sure it fits the way it's supposed to, and yeah, it seems like that should do the trick. I was desperately trying not to overcomplicate this, and I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Simple, but I think it'll be very effective. And to make it look a bit nicer, we'll hit that with some silver barbecue paint. Alright, it's ready to install, and just in time since we've got new transmission pan hardware. We also have these high collar split locks. You can see how much beefier they are than the ones that came with the pan. The 1-inch bolts are perfect for installing the heat shield, and our freshly painted shift cable bracket that mounts over on the driver's side. With the cable back in place and clipped in, we'll replace all of the shorter transmission pan bolts before torquing them to 130 inch-pounds. After this sits for a while, we'll come back through and retorque them to the same spec. Of course, there's one final important test of the heat shield. It's certainly a tight fit, but the connector for the transmission switch can still be plugged in. It sits about as close to the exhaust flange as it could without touching it. There's a decent sized air gap between the actual header tube and the shield, which is exactly what you want to reduce the transfer of heat. With that, we're almost done with the transmission stuff, but there are 2 more things I'd like to do while we're here. The first is replacing this mangled steel vacuum line that goes down to the transmission modulator with a rubber hose. Really just because that thing has been rattling around and annoying me forever. The hose isn't necessarily the best long-term solution, but for now it should do fine. The last thing for the transmission is bolting back up the inspection cover. We'll tighten down the 2/4 inch bolts right up against the transmission pan, and for some reason we don't have an upper mounting hole on the passenger side, but at least nobody's mangled the other end of the bell housing flange, so the inspection cover still has 3 bolts to hold it up. And what the heck, while we're in the area, we may as well torque the engine mount through bolts to 50 foot-pounds, just so I don't forget to do it later. As far as finishing up the transmission, it would be nice to fill it and leak test it now, but since the transmission cooler lines are still unhooked at the radiator end, we're gonna wait to do all that at once.